Morning, everyone. We're really proud to have Zack joining us today. He's done a power of work in growing our movement, not just here in the UK, but across England, Wales and beyond. We're looking at record results in 2 weeks' time, as is Zack and the rest of the Green Party of England and Wales. Reason for that is that people are scunnered with Labour and the chance that they have absolutely squandered. We've already shown the huge value of voting Green, with Greens delivering free bus travel for young people, scrapping peak rail fares and ending school meal debt. With more Green MSPs, we can do even more, and we're looking forward to working with Zack to deliver that and to demand better for Scotland. Zack.
Thank you. I just learned the word scunnered last night, and now I've heard it twice in 24 hours. So. It's really, really exciting to be here in Scotland. It feels like a huge moment, both for the Scottish Green Party, but for Green parties all around the world that are experiencing this green surge right now. People know that Labour are done and dusted. They have failed on almost every measure that you can hold them to account for. And people are looking for an alternative. And I know right across England and Wales, but in particular in Scotland, when people see an alternative like reform that push a toxic, divisive kind of politics, it really strengthens the need right now for a Green Party that will tackle inequality and protect our environment. I'm proud of the work of Green MSPs. For instance, scrapping school meal debt, making sure that we've got bus travel that's free for under 22s, although it's time to extend that even further, and providing a living wage for all workers. So I'm incredibly excited to be here today, even more excited for what happens in 2 weeks' time. I'm really confident that these guys will be seeing record-breaking results in Scotland. Confident, but I know they're not complacent. They're going to be out there campaigning for every single vote for the next 2 weeks. So thank you very much for having me, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Right, folks, we've got, there are more of you than there is realistically time for questions. So we're going to try and get through as many folk as possible, as quickly as possible. What I'm going to ask is one question each in the first round, and then we will give folk follow-up opportunities, but I don't want, if anybody goes on for too long and your colleagues just miss out entirely, that's not fair on the team overall. But happy to, if folk want to indicate, I'm presuming everybody wants to ask a question, but if folk want to indicate in the first instance, Simon, you were the first with your hand up. If you could introduce yourself and the title that you're from, that would be helpful.
Thank you very much, Mr. Polanski. Simon Johnson from the Daily Telegraph. You were asked earlier this week about the recent arson attacks on solar ambulances in London, and you basically said there's a conversation to be had about whether it's a perception of unsafety or whether it's actual unsafety. Isn't there true there's no conversation at all if you're talking about something like arson attacks? How can it be just a perception? And do you owe an apology to the members of the Jewish community who are upset by this, by your comments?
Well, I'm sure you'll have noticed that I am a member of the Jewish community and one of 5 people in British history who have been Jewish and in a leadership position. So I take anti-Semitism really seriously, as I do all forms of hate crime and racism. What I'm being very specific about is an arson attack is clearly a group of people being unsafe. That's an attack. At the same time, we've got groups like the Reform Party who put out a picture of me online where I'm dressed as a Nazi, an artificial intelligence picture. That makes me feel unsafe. That's very different to actually being unsafe. So what I'm talking about, and it's easy to clarify, is there are experiences of physical harm to people or to buildings. That's unsafety. And then there's a general feeling around Jewish communities right now, of which I'm a person in a Jewish community, of perception of unsafety because of a rising rhetoric that's happening towards Jewish people. Putting all of that aside, I think it's outrageous to see the Labour government in Westminster, who are often politicising this attack against the Jewish person. I've been very clear, as have the Scottish Greens, that what we're seeing in Israel for the past few years is an ongoing genocide, and we have a Westminster government that have been selling arms and sharing intelligence with Israel. That's very different to anti-Semitism. And I know that you're better at this in Scotland, but being really clear about the difference between anti-Semitism and legitimate criticism of the Israeli government. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And we'll go to Justin next.
Justin Bowie from the Press and Journal. We've spoken during the election to people involved with the oil and gas industry constantly, and they want to see more drilling. They are worried about the future of that industry. What would you say to those in that industry that would see you guys as a really, really strong opponent to them, as somebody wanting to kill their industry? I mean, do you essentially want to kill the oil and gas industry?
We need to be talking and working with all workers, and I think Grangemouth is a good example of where there's been an unjust transition, where workers haven't been consulted with, haven't been negotiated. There's so much skills in those communities, and we need to be utilising those skills for the jobs of the future. At the same time, we have a climate crisis. The UN Secretary General was really clear this is the crucial decade of action. We need to be reducing our use of oil and gas, and we need to be having a major investment in renewable energy. This sometimes gets talked about in the language of sacrifice, but actually there's a huge opportunity here to make sure that we're reskilling people, that we're investing in people, we're building the jobs of the future. It almost doesn't matter, though, what an ideological position of a politician is, because there's a geological reality as well. The geological reality is we can't keep drilling for oil and gas. We can't keep going with that industry. It's not going to work in terms of climate breakdown. And also, the reserves are running out. So we need to make sure that we're investing in the new industries. So the final thing I'd say is it's no good for someone to just say that and not work with the workers. But I know Scottish Greens have been consistent, as we have in England and Wales, that we want to work alongside those workers to make sure that they're at the table from the very beginning. The best time to have done this work would have been 20, 30 years ago. It didn't happen. We can't relitigate history, but what we can do is set that right now and make sure that people are working with the workers alongside trade unions to make sure that we're creating a better relationship to look at what the jobs of the future are.
Actually, we need to make sure that we take those workers with us, and we need to make sure that they have those good jobs for the future. It's not an either or. This basin is declining. There is a reality that we're not going to be able to drill for everything that's there for forever. And actually, if we don't put that transition in train now, we've seen what's happened with Grangemouth, with Moss Moran, with the lack of those just transition plans. We still don't have a proper one for the North East, and that needs to be started yesterday to make sure that we do have those long-term jobs, that those workers can transfer their skills while their jobs are still there, rather than what we've seen at Moss Moran and Grangemouth, where those plans have only been put in place once the doors are already shut. So making sure that that happens with workers, with trade unions at the middle of it, designing what they want to see in their communities for generations to come to support those communities, is something that is pretty much non-negotiable at this point.
Chris?
Hi, Mr. Polanski. I'm Chris McCall. I'm from the Daily Record. Here in Glasgow, shipbuilding supports 3,000 jobs directly. A similar number are tied to the naval bases further up the Clyde, at Faslane and Coolport. Now, the Greens, both in Scotland and in England and Wales, you're very vocally against Trident. You're also against NATO. But would a Green-led government at Westminster, led by yourself, ultimately mean the loss of thousands of defence jobs here in Scotland?
Well, ultimately, it will be up to the Scottish Government to decide what happens with jobs in Scotland. And so any kind of government in Westminster that was led by any Green would make sure that we were respecting the independence of Scotland. That being said, to take on your question directly, we know that lots of those jobs in shipbuilding are about building ships that aren't necessarily for the Navy. And so I think it sometimes gets overstated how much of an issue this is. Of course, we need to take national security seriously. Of course, we need to make sure that the country is able to defend itself. And at the same time, we need to recognise that shipbuilding jobs are often about a whole range of industries and not just a narrow range of defence.
Defence is reserved for Westminster, though, I would say. So if, hypothetically, you come into power in the next 2-3 years, ultimately defence would be your responsibility. It wouldn't be up to Holyrood where naval shipbuilding contracts will go, and it'd be up to you in Westminster. And that's the kind of question I'm asking is, it would be a Green government in London that ultimately would be deciding the jobs in the Clyde. And I guess that's what workers here would be worried about, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and make sure that we were speaking with those workers, making sure that people are assured that shipbuilding jobs that aren't in defence, we're absolutely going to make sure we're protecting and, in fact, promoting. It's really important that we have manufacturing that comes from this country, that we have economic sovereignty in this country, and that we're making sure that we're protecting the jobs of the future.
And there's countries like Finland that are shipbuilding powerhouses, but it's commercial shipbuilding. They build cruise ships, they build ferries, etc. Scotland can be like that. There's more that we can and should be doing to support shipbuilding on the Clyde for non-defence purposes. We've got kind of trapped in Scotland where we think the only kind of shipbuilding jobs you can have are for defence contracts, naval contracts. That's not the case. Historically, that wasn't the case. We were a shipbuilding powerhouse in commercial shipbuilding for not just decades, for centuries. On the defence point, though, Chris, it is worth confirming that from our position as a pro-independence party, for the Scottish Greens, Faslane would be the headquarters of an independent Scotland's naval forces, so we would have no intention of closing that base. It would absolutely be a non-nuclear base. We would want to rid ourselves of the evil of the Trident arsenal, but Faslane would still form the linchpin of our naval forces in an independent Scotland. Who's up next? We'll go to Abby next.
Hello. Sorry, I'm behind two very tall men. So earlier this week, Politico said that you were considering revisiting the Green Party of England and Wales anti-monarchy stance. So a few years ago, it emerged that the Queen had lobbied the Scottish Parliament for an exemption to a green energy bill, and the royal family has also kind of come under fire for its use of private flights and having high carbon emissions. So I was just wondering, how does that sort of square with green policies to, you know, back the monarchy? And I'm Abby Grant-Crosby from the National. I totally forgot.
No problem at all. I'm definitely not backing the monarchy, and in fact the story is inaccurate, and so it's good to be able to clarify. What I said to Politico, and it's been quoted accurately, but the headline, I would say, doesn't represent what the quote says, is that we are a party that when I ran to be leader of the Green Party of England and Wales, we had 50,000 members. We've now got over 225,000. Democratic making of our policy is something that we're proud of in Greens, England and Wales, as I know Scottish Greens are too, and that democratic principle will remain. What isn't working right now, in my opinion, as best as it could, is the fact that, you know, a couple of thousand people might come to conference. So I want to look at a more democratic way of making sure that we're deciding our policies. That being said, it's not up to me as leader of the Green Party of England and Wales to decide what that principle is. I'm just putting forward a conversation to say I think members are increasingly wanting a more democratic route to policy making. I was then asked, well, what about your policies like the monarchy? Well, that hasn't been in our manifesto because I don't think it's an urgent priority for people when they're struggling with their bills. But in terms of the party's position and my position, I certainly don't back the monarchy.
Thanks very much. Rebecca?
Thank you. Rebecca McCurdy from The Herald. Just to go back to NATO, I just wonder if you could clarify whether your position is to leave NATO or whether you'd reform it from the inside, and is that a split from the Scottish Greens?
Yeah, I'll answer the question directly, but I also want to just caveat it with why the question almost doesn't matter, and then I will answer it. Is that Donald Trump, who has a massive amount of disproportionate power in NATO, has said that he wants to annex Greenland, something the Danish Prime Minister has said that they think he absolutely intends to do. And no one who even backs NATO has ever been able to give a coherent answer about what happens when one NATO country starts to attack another NATO country, because an attack on one is meant to be an attack on all. At the same time, I think Brexit is one of the biggest disasters that has faced the UK, and I know Scotland in particular was dragged out against its will. It's been a disaster for social reasons, economic reasons, and indeed in our security. So to answer your question directly, my position would be to build closer alliances with our European neighbours. I think we clearly need to build better relationships with them. This idea that Donald Trump and the United States, we have a special relationship with them, or they're in some way our ally, I just don't think stands up to any scrutiny. By the way, it's not just Donald Trump. I think there's been problematic presidents for a long time, but I think Donald Trump is the clearest indication you can get when he goes out on Truth Social one day and says that he intends to wipe out an entire civilization, and then we don't get a word of condemnation from our Prime Minister on the same day, yet he can post about Wireless Festival. It starts to seem a little bit odd of this relationship. So my personal position is to build that better relationship right now, and then when the time is right, because we've built that alternative alliance, to withdraw from NATO.
Just to come back on that very quickly, is it more about removing the connection to, or the relationship with America and Donald Trump specifically?
Well, I think it's all of those things, and I think, you know, it's not for me to tell Scotland what to do either, but I'd really like to see Donald Trump kicked out of his golf courses. I don't think that, you know, you should be able to start illegal and unpopular wars and still have golf courses. And actually, I'd love to see those golf courses brought into community ownership. As I say, that's just a personal opinion. I definitely haven't come as an English politician to tell Scotland what to do, but it seems outrageous that Donald Trump's still able to enjoy those golf courses.
We'll go to Libby and then John.
Hello there, Libby Brooks from The Guardian. Zack, I wanted to ask you, you spoke in your New Statesman interview earlier this week about how you came to recognise that anti-Semitism was used as an attack line against Jeremy Corbyn. Do you have concerns that a similar row could engulf the Greens? And what would you say, especially to Jewish Green members, to reassure them that you'll make sure it won't?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. The first thing to say is... for a second. The first thing to say there is that we have 4,500 candidates standing up for election. One case of anti-Semitism is one case too many. But at the moment, from reports I've seen, we're talking about a handful of cases. So I think it is important to keep these things in perspective. That being said, we know that there's a worrying rise of anti-Semitism in this country, as, by the way, there's a rise of Islamophobia and hate crime generally. And so it's really important for anyone who's in public life, and certainly a leader of a political party, that they take that seriously. I'd add to that, I know I've mentioned it already, but I'm Jewish myself, so there's both a political importance to making sure we clear this up, but frankly a personal reason too. I certainly don't want to see anti-Semitism in society or indeed in any political party. In terms of what I talk about, the weaponization of it, I think it's important to have absolute clarity that anti-Semitism definitely exists, and sometimes people will say things that are anti-Semitic. At the same time, I've seen reports in the press of things that people have supposedly said that are anti-Semitic that absolutely aren't anti-Semitic. They're pro-Palestinian. And they are very, very different things. And to have Keir Starmer as Prime Minister supposedly condemn my comments yesterday as shameful, I think we've got into a bizarre situation in this country where a non-Jewish Prime Minister is attacking the one Jewish leader on a case of anti-Semitism. And I think to most members of the public, they look at that and they go, that just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And so, to repeat, where I started, anti-Semitism is really serious. We need to tackle it. And when people create false allegations of anti-Semitism or blur the lines between challenging the Israeli government and anti-Semitism, as a Jewish person, that makes me feel a lot less safe. That makes me feel like I'm being held accountable for a country that I don't believe has anything to do with my Jewish identity. And so I think it's incumbent on all politicians, particularly the Prime Minister at this point, to treat anti-Semitism with the consideration and care and nuance that a really serious issue requires, rather than waiting until the day that nominations were published and then releasing dossiers to newspapers, whereas if they'd had genuine concerns about possible anti-Semitic candidates, then surely the public good thing to do and the moral thing to do would have been to alert the party and to say, I believe this person might be standing for you. Do you know about their previous record? But instead, we've ended up playing silly games with a really serious issue. And I find that disgusting.
Go to John next and then Gina.
Zack, the Scottish Tories are having a press
John,
conference.
introduce yourself.
Sorry, John Boothman from Times. The Scottish Tories are having a press conference this morning talking about the mass industrialisation of the Highlands and Islands and the borders, all to do with the growth of pylons and applications for pylons. Is your position not quite analogous to the same as the Tories?
I don't think it's analogous in terms of, well, first of all, we have a nature crisis. We live in one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world, and it's really important that we protect green space. But I would just note that the Tories have a history in Westminster government of destroying green space, and a history of not investing in renewable energy, a history of not taking the climate crisis seriously. In fact, I have David Cameron's words ringing in my ears as I say this, to cut the green crap, which costs people thousands of pounds on their energy bills. At the same time, we do need renewable energy, so that will require pylons in certain places. It will require energy infrastructure. I think it's about treating people like grown-ups. I think far too often what is called consultation is actually notification. People have made a decision. They haven't spoken to the community. I think there's a real conversation here about community energy, and Scotland is so resource-rich with energy, and there is so much potential to bring communities together to actually make sure it's benefiting their community, both from an energy point of view, but also that they're reaping the benefits, the commercial or financial, economic benefits of that energy. And the final thing I'd say, without being hyperbolic about this, is less so in Scotland, thankfully, but there's certainly pockets. We're seeing the rise of the far right in the UK, and I think one of the reasons for that, although it's complex, is because people feel like politics is being done to them rather than with them. And I think community energy is one of the brilliant examples where there's so much space to consult with people, to engage with people, to both protect our green spaces when appropriate, and also make sure that we're investing in renewable energy in the future.
We've had this in my region in the west of Scotland. We've had it's a really acute issue in the Highlands and the borders. A lot of the frustration these communities feel is that this infrastructure is being built on their doorsteps, and they're still paying the highest energy bills of anyone in the UK. It's a frustration of ours that energy is not a devolved issue. We would nationalise the whole energy system in the UK. We think the system is designed to maximise company profits rather than provide people with affordable energy. But in terms of the devolved powers that are available to us, one of the key policies in our manifesto is making sure that communities genuinely benefit from renewable infrastructure on their doorstep, because the community benefit schemes that we've seen up until now have been pretty gimmicky and have actually led to a lot of that community anger that you're hinting at, John. So we would set it out as a requirement of consenting for these infrastructure projects that the communities very directly get a share of the profits from them. So we can't cut their bills because it's simply not within devolved competency, but we can quite literally give give them more cash to pay those bills, so effectively have them compensated for that. Community-owned energy is something that we want to see a massive expansion of in Scotland. We also recognise that for some of this infrastructure, you're talking about very, very large projects that realistically cannot be entirely community-owned. The community deserve to see more of the benefit from that, though. Gina?
Thanks very much. Gina Davison from LBC. Good morning. Mr Polanski, can I ask you if you agree with your colleagues on either side of you that US troops should be kicked out of Scotland? And can I also ask, you were talking about Trump earlier, do you think there's a possibility that voters could ultimately turn against reform because of Nigel Farage's continued support for Donald Trump?
I do agree on all counts. I think Nigel Farage really revealed himself when, in the first day or two of this illegal and unpopular war, he seemed to want to drag us in even further. I think the question you put to me also puts under the spotlight Keir Starmer's claims that we're not involved with this war, when we are giving permission to be able to use our naval bases, our air bases, when we have bombers flying from UK soil and using our airspace, then we clearly are involved. And I think about our European allies, people like Pedro Sanchez, the president of Spain, who were really clear with Donald Trump that this is unacceptable. And I would say, I was watching the debate that Gillian did with John Swinney, and I was surprised to see him not condemn the use of US submarines in Scottish waters for this war. It felt a little bit like playing both sides. And I think on an issue as serious as what's been happening in Iran, what's been happening in Lebanon, and what's been happening under the name of Donald Trump, that we are complicit in if we don't remove the use of our bases and also the use of our Air Force, then that does worry me. But to finish the question, I think Nigel Farage has shown us over and over again that he favours his relationship with Donald Trump than with the UK, and then certainly with Scotland. I very rarely hear Farage talk about Scotland. And so I think it's about making sure that people know that that relationship is there, and that if you don't trust Donald Trump, you certainly shouldn't trust Nigel Farage.
Yeah. Trump seems to be a millstone around the neck of his allies in other countries, whether it is Hungary or Australia or Canada. Pretty consistently, the candidates he's endorsing in other countries' elections are losing, in no large part because of their association with him, particularly now that people are seeing the impact of his war and how much they're paying at the moment for fuel, but we're very quickly going to see it for things like food and medicine as well. I think Mark... Oh, sorry, Gillian.
No, but ultimately it is the right thing to do to remove the troops from using Prestwick as a de facto. We've seen that Trump is quite willing to bomb civilian infrastructure to get his own way. There is no way that we should be complicit in any of that, and waiting till he's done something like that to then react is having us being complicit in the deaths of those civilians. And I think while we're looking at an increasingly scary world, we do, as Scotland, have to be that force on the world stage for peace and making sure that we're not complicit in any of these acts, whether it be by Trump or by any other world leader who decides to follow his lead.
Mark, and then we'll come over to Tom.
Good morning, Mark McLaughlin from The Sun. The Scottish Green Manifesto pledges to turbocharge gender-affirming treatment in Scotland, saying the waiting lists are years, even decades long.
Centuries.
Centuries long. In that context, the Scottish Government is challenging the UK-wide guidance that says single-sex spaces are reserved for biological sex. They say it would be dangerous if that was applied to prisons, saying that transgender people would be equally at risk in either prison. Today, we learned that a transgender woman has been charged with sexual assault in a prison in Greenock. A couple of years ago, we had a rapist was sent to a female prison, prompting a huge outcry. So, in your view, can a woman be a rapist? And what would you do to solve this UK-wide situation that's tied Scotland in knots for years?
Well, the rapes are horrendous, and it's important to start with that. It's also important to say that when the UK Supreme Court made its judgment, we had a Prime Minister who said, that's the court's view, so that's my view. But that's not how legislation works. As a politician and as a Prime Minister, it's our job to get the law right, to make sure that it's watertight, and to make sure that it protects the rights of all people. We also know there's been a very disturbing trend of transgender hate crime and of transphobia. We also know that this is an increasingly toxic environment for transgender people just to live their life. And what I always want to get back to is whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're struggling to pay your bills, whether you're struggling to pay your rent, whether you're struggling to put food on your table. These are all universal issues. And actually, I think far too often this conversation can become about very niche cases, where actually what we should be doing, particularly in places like prisons, is assessing prisoners on a case-by-case basis and making sure it's bespoke to the prisoner rather than their gender identity.
Just to
I think it's unhelpful to start to try and whittle people down to their genitalia or how they identify. I think the point is any human being can be violent. I think any human being can commit heinous crimes. And the important thing there is making sure, first of all, we work on prevention so we don't have the crime in the first place. And the second thing is, if the crime does happen, to make sure that it's dealt with appropriately. But I don't think it's about smearing whole groups of people and certainly whole gender identities or trans people, as opposed to going, actually, let's look at individual behaviour and make sure we're preventing these crimes happening in the first place.
Rapists should clearly be in prison, but to use your language, Mark, the logical conclusion of the biological sex-based policy would result in men and women's prison. It would result in trans men and women's prison. I have a trans man who's a friend of mine who asks me to use him as an example, not in this case because he's not in prison, but as a general rule. He makes the point that by biological sex definition, he would have to use women's spaces. As a trans man, he's a 6-foot-tall bald man with a beard, and he repeatedly says, would it really make women feel safer if I have to use the same changing rooms as them, for example, if somebody like him who'd committed an offence had to be in a women's prison? That's why we would echo Zack's point there around making sure that you have individual risk assessments in these situations, because the key thing has to be about maximising safety here. Sorry, I've talked too long at this point. I said I was going to come to Tom.
Thank you. Tom Gordon from the Daily Mail. This may be a quick question for all of you. John Swinney has said this week he would like to work with Sinn Féin to bring about Scottish independence. Sinn Féin have said they want to work with the SNP on the same go. What do the Greens think? Will you be working with Sinn Féin to bring it about?
So for the last 10 years, I've sat on one of the Good Friday Agreement bodies. I've sat on the British-Irish Parliamentary Assembly. So I have worked with Sinn Féin and with the DUP and with the UUP and all other parties in Northern Ireland. Clearly, we believe in Scottish independence. Fundamentally, we believe in the right of the people of the constituent nations of the UK to self-determination. It's not for us to tell people in Northern Ireland what their constitutional future should be, but we have an ambition for Scotland to leave the United Kingdom, to do so democratically. And for as long as we remain within the United Kingdom, we will work with others, particularly those in government. If people in Northern Ireland choose to return Sinn Féin to the executive, which under power sharing is all but guaranteed, clearly we would work with them on issues such as the democratic right to decide. We collectively believe that it should be for the peoples of each of our constituent nations to decide on their own future. We have significant policy disagreements with Sinn Féin on a whole range of areas. We have a Green Party in Northern Ireland. They're our partners in Northern Ireland, not Sinn Féin. If Sinn Féin are in the executive, we would work with them in the same way that we would work with other executive parties. And we've seen that even with unionist parties. Welsh Labour, for example, in their government, have very often worked with the Scottish government on issues around respect for devolution, for example. So the short answer is that we have an ally in Northern Ireland. It's the Green Party of Northern Ireland, and we will all be campaigning next year for them to be returned to Stormont, because I think their presence there is sadly missed.
It's definitely none of my business, but the point I would make to add on to Ross is, who the hell does Wes Streeting think he is? The way that he spoke about Scotland recently, as if Westminster owns Scotland, as if you need to bring out your begging bowl and ask for permission. If there is a pro-independence majority in 2 weeks' time, then I think that should be case done, because ultimately that is the people of Scotland in a democratic election voting for people who are not hiding their want and desire for independence, who are being very vocal about their want and desire for independence for Scotland. And the idea that there would be a democratic election in Scotland where the majority of people vote for parties that want independence, and then Wes Streeting or any Labour minister, and certainly the Prime Minister, would turn to Scotland and go, oh, we know what you want, but you can't have it because we're not giving you permission. That is outrageous. It's crucially undemocratic, but also I think it reveals the real quite frankly, sinister attitude that this Labour Westminster government have had towards Scotland and the people of Scotland, and about their basic rights to determination.
Just a quick follow-up to you, Mr. Polanski. Can you clarify how you would separate Donald Trump from the Scottish golf courses? Because seizing the assets of people you disagree with seems legally problematic.
Well, I think more problematic is a genocide in Gaza and killing innocent people in Lebanon and in Iran. And so we've talked for a long time about sanctions that the UK government should be putting on Israel. But frankly, I think there's places where we should be sanctioning Donald Trump, where it's possible, and I think very likely, he's committing war crimes. And I think removing him from the golf course feels like the very least we could do.
Yeah, we literally have obligations, like every other member state does, that signed up to the Genocide Convention. We have obligations under the Genocide Convention to prevent genocide and to take action against those who perpetrate it. Stuart, I think you were next. We're running out of time, I'm afraid, folks. So if folk who still want to ask a question could keep your hand up for a second so I've got an idea. Cool. Right, well, I don't know if we're going to get around everybody, but I'll try. Sorry, Stuart.
Hi, Stuart Patterson from the Glasgow Times. In this city, we've got a housing emergency, and it's exacerbated by the number of asylum seekers who then get a positive leave to remain decision, and they present as homeless to the City Council. Should the Home Office stop sending so many asylum seekers to Glasgow? And do you think a city like Glasgow needs more or less immigration?
I think there's already a housing crisis, both, well, around the country. There's a housing crisis, and we've had decades of underinvestment, partly to do with the Westminster government I was just talking about in the previous conversation. And so I think we need to be dealing with those problems. And I think what people recognise over and over again is that the problems in our cities and the problems in our towns are not caused by migrants or people who are fleeing from war and persecution. The problems are caused by decades of underinvestment and austerity and a refusal to tax the rich. Now, I know a wealth tax in Scotland is not as simple as it is in terms of the Westminster government, but I know from these guys, from their manifesto, there's lots of levers that can be pulled to make sure that ultimately we're taxing the wealth of the super rich, multimillionaires and billionaires, and also making sure we're reducing people's bills and protecting them from the rising cost of living. And so I think immigration so often becomes this binary choice between Scottish communities and migrants. But actually, I know most people just want to know that the system is fair, that it's transparent, and that actually when push comes to shove, people want to see a compassionate approach to migration. They just want to know the system's fair.
We'll do Louise and then Kat, and then I'm going to see what the time's like at that point.
Hi, Louise Wilson from Holyrood Magazine. Under your leadership, the Green Party of England and Wales have obviously experienced quite a bounce in the polls recently and are doing fairly well. You compare that to the Scottish Greens, who are polling better than they have at any point in history, but maybe not quite as much, not seeing quite as much of a bounce as they are down south. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think the first thing is polls only matter so much. Actually, what matters is results. And in 2 weeks' time, these guys, along with Scottish Greens, have an opportunity to demonstrate some record-breaking results. And I know that polls have varied quite tremendously in terms of what those results look like. But I also know there's a confidence, but not complacency, that it will be a record number of MSPs in the Scottish Parliament, and also that we could be looking at double figures of MSPs. So I'd say that's pretty impressive under kind of any measure and under any criteria. I think there's a second thing too about some of what is driving the surge in England and Wales is resentment and anger at the Labour government. I think people are very positive about the Green Party of England and Wales too, naturally, but I think there's a balance there too. I think devolution means that it's a slightly different conversation in Scotland, and I think some of that resentment happened a few years ago anyway and started to move towards the Green Party. I think it's also important to say, though, that the polling in for Scottish Greens is really good. It's looking really, really promising and is on the upwards trajectory. And actually, ultimately, it's always about just making sure it's moving in the right direction.
Kat?
Hello, Mr. Polanski, Katrina Stewart from The Scotsman. You said case done, but obviously the situation is not that straightforward. So what would your advice be to, what would you say that John Swinney should do if the UK government just says no to a second independence referendum?
Well, I realise the question's a bit meta because it's definitely not for me to recommend to Scottish politicians what they should do. What I think the Westminster government should do is to recognise the democratic will of the Scottish people. And I think there's something unstoppable about a movement happening in this country. And I think the conversation, by the way, is starting to happen in Wales too, where Wales recognise the kind of underinvestment. They're a few years behind the conversation, I guess, about independence, but it's certainly starting to bubble away. And I think that's only so long you can keep people in a system or in a process that is against their will before people understandably get more resentful, more angry, more frustrated. And I think that's been happening in Scotland for a while. And I think it gets to the point where I can't see why a UK Prime Minister would want to keep a country in a union who had demonstrated so clearly with votes that they didn't want to be in that union anymore. And I think at some point, not that I think Scotland should have to ask for permission, but there becomes a point where the Westminster government realises it's against their own interests anyway to keep a country that keeps rejecting them so clearly. It almost becomes embarrassing. It's like having a house party and your guests tell you they really don't want to be there, but you've locked the door. And so ultimately, I think we need to make sure that the people have keys to their own front door and they're able to make the decisions they want to. I guess the epilogue I want to put on that is, I hope it comes across, but I'm really fond of Scotland. So this isn't me kind of saying, I hope Scotland, disappears. I want us to maintain really strong relationships in the same way that the Green Party of England and Wales have with Scotland. This is just about where power lies. And we believe in the principle of subsidiarity, that ultimately power should be at the most local level. And it seems obvious that if a country wants to govern itself and be independent, then it should have the ability and power to do so.
Right, we've got, I think, seconds left. And sorry, John, but David's not had the opportunity to ask a question at all.
Hi, I'm Dave Walker from the Scottish Daily Express. On Mark's point about the sexual assault in a female prison, J.K. Rowling has tweeted blaming the Scottish Government for this. Just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
I think when you look at polling, less than 1% of people say that trans rights are an important issue to them. And by the way, that could include people who are trans, and it could include people like J.K. Rowling who tweet about this quite regularly. And actually what I think is what people want to see from their government is lower bills. They want to see taxes on the very wealthiest. And they also want to see compassion towards people and towards communities. And as a gay man, I feel this strongly because I grew up under Section 28, and I remember what it feels like to grow up in an environment where you're othered, or you're not allowed to be spoken about at school, or you have some sort of secret that feels like it's not acceptable to society. So, of course, we must absolutely make sure that women are leading this conversation, that women are in this conversation. And I know lots of women that I speak to who are inclusive feminists who say that they absolutely know that trans women are also women too. And so I just think everyone, including J.K. Rowling, could demonstrate more compassion and more care towards everyone in this situation and have conversations that bring people together and move towards solutions, rather than the constant kind of conversations about niche cases about bathrooms when actually people just want to pee in peace.
Thank you very much, folks. I'm really sorry in particular, John, but we've... if you...
We need to wrap up.
Yeah.
The story in the Times suggests that Donald Trump and the US government are reviewing their position in supporting British sovereignty over the Falklands. Where are you guys in that, and do you think the Falklands should be handed back anyway?
I think under all circumstances, Donald Trump, through bullying and threats, shouldn't get to define any other nation's policy. Regardless of how we might feel on that particular policy, Donald Trump doesn't get to bully his way across the world. It is beyond unthinkably mad that we had European nations deploying their special forces to Greenland, planning to blow up airstrips, shipping in blood supplies because they were expecting a potential conflict with what's supposed to be our closest military ally in the US. Trump doesn't get to dictate UK policy. Trump shouldn't get to dictate UK policy in any area. The fact that Keir Starmer so often lets him do that, particularly in the use of our air bases to launch the war against Iran, is completely out of order. On that, though, we're already running over, and I've mucked up our timetable for the rest of the day.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Oh, picture. Sorry.